I'm Lisa Keefauver, founder of Reimagining Grief. I'm host of the podcast Grief is a Sneaky Bitch and author of the book of the same name. I'm a narrative therapy trained social worker. Narrative therapy asks us to pay major attention to the language we use to describe our problems. Words are creative, not descriptive. They create worlds, they don't describe worlds. And so narrative therapy helps people see their struggles in the context of their language, both the language they use for themselves and the language others use about them, and then sort of use language to flip the script, to think about all the resources and abilities and capacities that might enable somebody to take on the challenge of their life. Often in traditional psychology, we invite people to look in and find the sense of their own problem as their own. They look at their problem as if it's created within and then it's something that they need to solve. But in narrative therapy, we always invite people to think about themselves in the context of the broader culture. And that context is really important because so many of us have an inner narration about what we should or shouldn't feel or do or behave that we don't recognize. I shouldn't be feeling this way, I should feel better now. And just asking people to interrogate, whose story is that? Is should in this case helping you or hurting you? We can often trace it back to some triggering event. So even recognizing when we draw together the line of those triggering stories, we must recognize that even that is a story arc that we're creating, right? But I think the first time I experienced it is surviving rape at 15 and coming back into my family and my community and beginning to tell a story that was being influenced by culture, that there was something wrong with me, that there was shame related to that experience, that it was something that was not to be talked about, and that it made other people uncomfortable. And so the story that I learned in that triggering event is keep it to yourself. This is not something to be discussed. If you're suffering, do it alone, right? There was a lot of that story that happens. Fast forward maybe a decade or two, and I found myself in love with the most incredible man, if I do say so myself, Eric Keefauver. But he became quickly unrecognizable, and when I was just 40 years old, after only 2.5 weeks between his diagnosis and his death, I found myself holding him as he took his last breath and had to go home and tell our 7-year-old daughter that her dad was dead. That was a real life-shifting, trajectory-shifting moment. Who am I in the world? How can I trust the safety of the world? I'm not a wife anymore. I'm now an only parent, not a couple parenting a child. I think when a lot of us, and myself included, have had a lot of hard things back to back, I thought, well, I've paid my dues, certainly. I've done the emotional work, I've done the grieving, I've done the therapy, the EMDR. I'm okay now. And then, as it turned out, like my husband, I got diagnosed with cancer and found myself at the age of 52 navigating breast cancer treatment. And so I think part of what happened in that event was, again, another opportunity for me to practice what I've been talking about today. Today is round 8 of chemotherapy. And so early on in my treatment course, which included surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, immunotherapy, I worked really hard to write, speak with friends, speak on my podcast, and notice the language I was using as a way to be present. And I thought, well, who am I if I'm not producing a show, seeing clients? You know, there was a real reckoning.
I can't remember, about my current cancer diagnosis, and oh, well, this is me. If we can, I'd love to start where I start with all of my guests over these last 4 years, really helping us all interrogate, where do our grief beliefs come from?
This is a beautiful question. So
I don't think very often about this.
I think I describe my family as grief averse.
It was when my grandmother was buried.
There was a grieving process there that was kind of clenched jawed.
Stiff upper lip. How come this was never discussed?
Yeah.
And I remember not being allowed to go to her funeral. I remember asking why I couldn't go, and the answer was, you're too young.
My memories were being teased on the playground, Willie defending me, another kid hitting him with a brick, and then I never saw Willie again.
I really never heard about her.
And that was kind of it. So we didn't really hold space for grief and loss in my family.
At such a young age in our culture, we try to protect people from death and dying as if it's not a part of the natural life cycle.
Yeah. I think grief in the West has been really co-opted in harmful ways. We wanted to make it into 5 stages. We wanted to make it very linear. We wanted to make it neat. So at some point, when we think about the perception box, we think about reframing. What other version of this story could be true? The minute we begin to even consider the possibility that there's another story, that there's another way to look at our relationship with our problem, that begins to open a door for us to move forward. And most importantly, it helps you understand that actually our lives are much more fluid than the stories we tell. We're never escaping the culture in which we inhabit, which means we are all a product of our own perception box, and each of our perception boxes impact one another. So with compassion, we reframe, or we might interrogate ourselves to say, when we start to feel that kind of stickiness, all of us feel in some way, shape, or form, is there something about the story I'm telling within my own perception box that is keeping me stuck, that is a limiting story? We don't have to do this alone. We can do this in conversation with others who are experiencing similar issues. We can do this with friends or family. We can do this in the mental health or therapeutic setting. But we are always living within our own individual perception boxes.
What do you see as the problematic stories in your space that maybe impinge your own identity story as a nurse?
As you experience story after story and you realize, we're going to see loss on a very regular basis, it forces you into a reckoning of, I'm not doing what I thought I signed up for. And I either change with this and I confront my own emotions about it and what it's like to be face to face with a mother whose child breathes their last breath, or I don't change and there's a part of me that really just gets cut off from humanity, from my patients, from my own self.
So I was being interviewed for something once where the first question was, who is Sunita? And I was not prepared for that. And I was like, I fumbled through some nonsense and I was like, can we redo that? I could not answer that question. And the first thing that came out of my mouth was the things I did. I'm a writer and I'm a doctor. And understanding very sadly that so much of that story is you are not enough. This is the subtext that has organized the text. The story of who you are is way more powerful than the story of what you do. And it's the one that has been the most fulfilling for me.
We look up at the night sky and there are trillions of stars in the skies, those stars like the experiences that we have in our lives. And then the stories that we tell ourselves, that culture tells us, that our family and friends and media tell us. We start to draw these points of A, B, and C, and they become our total identity story because they get told and retold and reinforced in our lives. I look up at the sky and the few stories I can recognize are Orion's Belt and the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper if I'm lucky to figure that out, right? But what we can do when we have a healthy narrative practice is to be able to zoom out and look at all the other stars in the sky or all the other experiences to look for what they call often exception stories or unique outcomes and begin to draw thicker, richer, more helpful stories.
The hippocampus is the brain's storyteller, connecting events into a single storyline. There's a lot of great research and work happening, understanding both how the brain works, but also the interaction between the brain and the storytelling, and how that can lead to healing or growth or lead to sort of stuck stories. We know that in the wake of a profound loss, many things shift in our brain. The stress response comes online. We see this as an existential threat to our well-being, especially depending on the loss. So things like memory, cognition, processing become really strained and taxed. And that's why we see things like heartbreak not being just a metaphor, but we see a very increased likelihood of heartbreak, heart disease, even heart attack in the wake of profound losses. I want to make sure I'm sleeping more than ever. I want to make sure I'm tending to my body. I want to make sure I'm getting hugs, because we know hugs invite oxytocin and all the good neurochemicals into our brain to help us feel better and feel less alone, which is a real consequence of our grief. We know that we humans are storytelling creatures. As long as we are alive, we are storytelling. And so when we bring ourselves with compassion to the stuck stories that are getting in our way, then we find this opportunity to write a new story, a story that reminds us that we have capacity, that we have agency, that we have resiliency. And these are the stories that we need to help us heal, to help us grow, to help us move forward.